Today's talk, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. What is the natural man? What is the authentic self? What does it mean to be a real person in society? And by real, I mean as natural as possible, whatever natural may be. What is the general will? What does he mean by the love of self and compassion? Today's talk, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778. I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with Rousseau. On the one hand, I love a lot of what he has to say. On the other hand, I hate some of his personal actions. We'll get into that later on. I also don't, maybe hate's too strong a word, I don't really understand why so much of his thinking is a bit contradictory, a little bit wordy maybe. I suspect it's because he's trying to reveal an understanding of life, of the universe, that's just a little bit too opaque, and that comes across in his readings, but we'll get to all of that. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is probably best, in my opinion, understood by understanding his personal history. A lot of philosophers wouldn't like that. Jacques Derrida, for an example, wouldn't really want us digging deeply into his life. He'd want us to be talking about his philosophy as something separate. But with Rousseau, I don't know how we can do that because his philosophy is so clearly derived from his life experiences. So let's discuss some of those, and we'll get a much better idea. Who is this person, and why is he thinking the way he is? So again, his philosophy is uniquely personal. He was born a Swiss citizen. He had a bit of a tough childhood. His mother died 10 days after he was born. He was raised by his father, who was a watchmaker, his aunt and nanny. At that time, he was relatively happy. His father would read well into the night with him books. Now, remember, this is the era before screens, before social media. So books were really important to he and his father's relationship. Rousseau learned to live through them, in them. Interestingly enough, he never went to school. Jean-Jacques Rousseau never had a formal education of any kind. So it's kind of an odd combination to really adore and appreciate books, but on the other hand, to have never really been given the opportunity to have a formal education. Unfortunately, at some point, Rousseau's father illegally challenged a landowner, to a duel, to the death. And what that meant ultimately is that because it was an illegal duel, not sanctioned by the state, apparently those were, he had to flee or be imprisoned. So he abandoned his son, Rousseau. Why would you challenge someone to a duel? Then why would you leave your son? These are open question marks. But this left Rousseau to be raised by a surrogate family. At 13, Rousseau was made an apprentice to an engraver. He enjoyed the work, but he really didn't enjoy the strictness of his employer. Like many of us, we resist people telling us what to do 24/7. But Rousseau had a heightened sense, not of rebelliousness, but of this independence. And it didn't matter at that time necessarily whether the authority was cruel or not. There were indications that, in fact, the authority might have been a bit cruel, but it still is the idea of what makes authority, what makes people who tell you what to do legitimate. And this is going to be an open question for us. At 16, he left his apprenticeship in surrogate home, electing instead to start a new life without a formal education, without any money, without any friends, or without any family. The account seems to be that he was outside the city gates at one point. You need to keep in mind that at that time, cities today are open. We don't have these big gates that we close at night to keep out pirates and thieves and whatnot. But he was stuck outside of these gates and he couldn't get back into the city. So he just basically decided, that's it, fine, I'll just go on my own. And he started wandering. And for the next 20 years, basically, he would be wandering, finding odd jobs, finding different ways to educate himself on different topics. Fortunately, after he found himself on his own, again at a young age of 16, he ran into a woman by happenstance, Madame de Warren, and she would change his life forever. She would change his life in terms of introducing him to wealthy, elite social players. She would change his life in terms of introducing him to a free library. She had a large library that he could have access to. That was a big deal. Obviously, for the time, too, to have a large library would be relatively rare. But here's Rousseau, someone who needed to be educated, never had that opportunity, but loved books. It was a perfect arrangement. But part of the introduction to this upper crust or the elite or whatever you want to call it was the revelation that there's a significant amount of indulgence and decadence with the upper class that really greatly troubled Rousseau. He saw the cruelty, the unnecessary cruelty that the people with money and power had. They just experienced the world in a way that seemed to lack pity, lacked compassion, and was just utterly cruel. They took delight in the fact that they were wealthy, they were rich, they had power, and others did not. And there are different stories of this. One of them, he was at a dinner party, and there was a server there, a woman server, who was serving them, and someone had jokingly introduced the local, I think it was local, wasn't a bishop, priest, as the Pope, to say kind of like, here's the Pope kind of thing. Or maybe it was a minister, I don't know. In the Protestant tradition, maybe it was a joke. It doesn't matter. And she forever would introduce, or she would see him as the Holy See, or the Father, the Pope, even though she should have known, of course, it wasn't really the Pope. There were stories that she was teased because she couldn't remember the months of the year. So obviously there's these, why would you tease someone for not being able to understand? Why would you go to take delight, take enjoyment in this false sense of superiority? Well, Rousseau picks up on this, and this has an impact on his understanding of what it means to have a good life, to be an authentic person. Never one to stay in any one spot for very long, Rousseau would leave and return to Madame Morin over the years. He took up music, taught himself music. He would actually make a living with music. At the age of 20, he and Madame Morin had a relationship together until she found someone else. I'm sure it would have been very disappointing for Rousseau. He, at the age of 44, realized his dream of living a somewhat solitary life in nature. This is a person who's been wandering his whole life looking for a place to be. He identifies that as in nature. And finally, at 44, after doing odd jobs and making something of a name for himself, he was able to break away from his friends and associates. And he found a woman, and he would have 5 children, which is wonderful for him. And then he would abandon each one of them in turn to an orphanage, which is not wonderful for them. This is one of those moments in Rousseau's life, multiple moments, where he made this persistent effort to have children, or he just had children, and the effort to abandon them, which is so odd because he becomes famous as someone who wants to think and talk about childhood education and how we ought to be raising and educating children. When asked about this, basically his response amounts to saying that they would be better off without him, that it was just, it's the way it seemed the best thing to do. In other words, it wasn't a very strong, rational, this is why I did what I did. It was more of a kind of an open-ended, this is kind of how I felt at the time, and it seemed like they would be better off. And I don't know if they would have been better off or not, but Rousseau did have some controversy follow him, in conflict with major players, political players. So maybe there was some sense in which he thought, I'm such a controversial figure in society that these children would be better off without me. I don't know. I'm just guessing here. But at the age of 44, in the forest, he was able to write 3 of his most popular and influential books: Julie, or The New Eloise, Emile, and The Social Contract. The first one, 1761, 1762, and then 1762 again for The Social Contract. What's interesting about Emile is that by that time, Rousseau had already gained a readership. People knew who he was, but they also had become somewhat upset with his ideas. He at one point had to flee France to avoid being arrested. He returned to Geneva, but he had already upset many intellectuals there as well with his radical ideas. And so Rousseau, again, sort of get this image from being kind of locked out of the city gates at a young age, wandering, finding a place in the forest, still being pushed out of the cities until he could get back to the forest to write his works. But even this idea of being able to return to culture, his ideas were so radical that was upset. And that would be very interesting. How many intellectuals exist today in our culture that we shun them because they're so radical? Or do we even hear those voices? Because there are many radical voices out there, but do we even hear them? Certainly Rousseau is one of them. The end of his life was relatively uneventful. He had returned to France 1770, where he took up work as a music copyist. Again, this is how he made his living throughout the years. But unfortunately, by the end, he was showing increasing signs of mental instability. And I'm reminded of someone like Nietzsche, these wonderful, prolific writers and thinkers. Their minds just seem to give out near the end, which is, of course, most unfortunate. The question before us, one of the big questions for Rousseau that he wants us to think about, is what is authenticity? He envisions this as something to do with the natural man. It would be more politically correct and inclusive and say natural person. Right? So what is this natural person? Rousseau's philosophy of life is rooted in experience and passion, not necessarily in a logically deductive or even a logically inductive kind of approach. He's fluid, which also leads into why there are ambiguities in his writing, and he uses terms fluidly in different ways. But we can kind of step back and glean the basics. And the basics for Rousseau is that human feeling should guide us, and that the dictates or the ideas of Enlightenment philosophy, whatever that is, and science, whatever that is, we're not sure what those are yet, they're messing up society somehow. Now, maybe these things can be good, but we need to find a way to legitimize human life in the context of Enlightenment scientific thinking, in which these things are largely making people miserable and unhappy. These things are corrupting human beings, as well as our greed and envy. We'll get to that in just a moment. So there's a problem, and he wants us to return to nature, just like he returned to nature to write his books. We need to find some measure of freedom. Is there an authentic self inside each one of us? Is there a natural self waiting to be revealed? Are we, for Rousseau, we are, sort of being conditioned and controlled by society in a corruptive way? And if we are, how do we free ourselves from that? And what would it look like? Well, let's begin with the initial point that science, the Enlightenment thinking, this obsession with rationality in general, Rousseau says these things aren't working. And they're not working, now remember this is a while ago, but there's the same basic things happening today. They're not working because people aren't happier than they were before, and people aren't more virtuous. That is, people aren't more kind, people aren't more compassionate than the previous generation. So if we say science is awesome, on what basis are we saying it's awesome? If we say technology is wonderful, Facebook's wonderful, has Facebook made people more compassionate, more kind, more understanding of the other? Maybe in some cases, but largely no. So if these things aren't helping society be better, are they neutral? Probably not. They probably don't have a neutral impact. Some of them no doubt do, but many of them probably have a negative impact. You may think of online bullies and social media, but also the loss of privacy rights, the hackers, all the scammers online. It's a whole ecosystem of mistrust, half-truths, and manipulation and propaganda for all of the good that the internet has provided. Remember, Rousseau is pre-internet, so I'm just sort of embellishing here, or adding to what he might be thinking. These things don't help society like we think they should, or that they could. We could do so much better with the technology. We could help people, but let's get back into that in just a minute. With Hobbes, we saw that without a government, people and societies, we are people in society, are not the best. Right? We're selfish, we're driven by egotism, the self before all others, and it's this basic selfishness and self-interestedness that creates a social contract. So we're afraid. Fear is a huge thing with Hobbes. All right. So we need to give up part of our power to a sovereign, the one to rule them all. Remember the conversation about the one ring to rule them all? Hobbes. Well, wait a minute. Other philosophers like Locke will say that we're born neutral. We're born as tabula rasa, as a blank slate. There's nothing either good or bad about us. We just get programmed, we get educated, we have life experiences, we adapt. Okay. But Rousseau says, no, we're actually born good, which makes it so hard to understand why he put his children up for adoption again if they're born good. But anyway, we're born good. So we're not born neutral, we're not born bad. So it's a very specific philosophy. It's optimistic, it's positive, we're born good. But the moment we're born good into the world, society gets its claws into us, and it makes us materialistic. It makes us like Hobbes largely envisions it, as this egotistical, selfish kind of creature. But it doesn't need to be that way. Society doesn't need to be that way. Just because society is driven by power-hungry, elite people who don't care about us, it doesn't mean it has to be that way. Because, again, Rousseau looks at nature And he sees that there's a harmony. He sees that it works. And that animals don't really invest in unnecessary cruelty. Animals kill other animals to survive, but they don't mock other animals. They don't treat them as playthings to be in pain inflicted on them so that you can have joy. But human beings do that. Consider the role, the power of being a billionaire and not distributing your wealth, knowing that there are those who are hungry around you. Now, there's an argument to be made that just throwing money at problems of world hunger won't directly solve it. It has to be done intelligently. New systems, new governments, new policies and laws have to be developed so that money can filter through and be effective and not just scooped up by the greedy. But to be a billionaire and to know that others are suffering and not really to do anything about it, just to sit on that pile of cash, not even investing in companies that can, hire more people and distribute wages and distribute funds that way. It's a strange world we live in where there's more and more inequality in terms of money. You've heard the phrase before, the one percenters in this generation, the one percenters are going to have virtually all of the wealth. So 1% of the population, all of the wealth. That alone gives us some reason to accept it. Rousseau was right. Maybe hundreds of years ago. He's observing the wealthy and the elite then, but they really do seem to not really care. So what do? Well, we can respond in anger or hatred, or we can think about what a new society, a better society would look like, fueled, he will say, by compassion, and motivated by pity and empathy. Well, we'll get to that in just a second. Like Hobbes, but ending up going in a different direction, Rousseau, in his discourse on inequality, offers a hypothetical thought experiment. What do people look like in nature? Specifically, whereas Hobbes said the state of nature is a terrible, brutish place, Rousseau is thinking, actually, there was a noble savage. The savage still would have been a brutal life, and it would have been largely an amoral life, but it would have been one in harmony with nature. So rough, tough, but it wouldn't have been this selfish, egotistical, I want what you have, I'm going to take what you have. It would be existing in some sense of balance with other noble savages because they had to, right? If you didn't live in some kind of harmony with others, then the alternative is that you have a society of war, of conflict. So he's asking us to imagine a world in pre-society that's not run by conflict and war. And he envisions this brutish and amoral but noble savage creature that is basically good. And from this I say creature, but from this prototype human, we learn a couple of things. One, we are not, for Rousseau, social creatures. That's not how we're designed. To be in society is an odd necessity. It may be necessary that we do this, but we are not social creatures. This flies in the face of what Hobbes is saying, but what Aristotle says, that our very nature is to be social. Rousseau doesn't buy it. Now remember Rousseau, right? This wandering person on his own, a very solitary existence, his whole life on his own, abandoned by his father, left alone. And he's saying, well, we're all kind of like that. But he goes further. We need to revive that sense of independence. We need to revive that sense of me, the authentic me, the natural me, pre-social conditioning. Now, I'm still going to be in society. He recognizes that we can't just leave society, but I can still authenticate me in the midst of all of these corruptive challenges and dangers and cruel people. The questions that follow, well, what will that look like? How ought we to live in society if we are primarily not social creatures, but we have to be social creatures? What will that look like? And education, what will that look like? If we're living in a world that's educating us to be cruel and to be selfish, how do we re-educate ourselves? How do we find a healthier form of education? In his famous book, The Social Contract, Rousseau discusses how we should structure our society, what it should look like. How do we get legitimate power? How do we hold and execute legitimate power? How should laws be created? And this obviously made a lot of people who were in power upset, because his basic argument was that it was the collective, we, that should be in charge, not a Hobbesian sovereign, not a president, not a queen, not a king, not one CEO. This is the top-heavy model, and it's all wrong. And instead, we need this thing called the general will. What is that? Well, recall that Rousseau was really pushing for this idea that at heart we are good. We want to make good decisions. We want to be kind. We want to be compassionate. And if we can tap into the will of the people, of the populace, that is good, that is natural, is healthy, compassionate, then that will win out over the cruelty and barbarism of the elite. The problem with Rousseau, and so many people misunderstand this, and I'm not sure that I understand it, is that, again, he's somewhat contradictory in his terms. He seems to switch positions on this here or there, but it's not clear exactly what the general will is. A, because it's clearly contextual in some sense. What society, what group of people are you talking about? And what specifically are they fighting against? What kind of injustices and inequalities exist in that culture that will be unique to that culture? So that'll add a relativism. That adds a degree of relativity to it. But this is the larger question of social authenticity. When he spends so much time talking about how society is corruptive, now he's giving us this concept called the general will, a good thing that is supposed to make society legitimate or authentic, more authentic than it was before. All right, well, the idea there is it's great. What would that look like? It's when people agree as a whole to something. It's not really a will. When you say the general will, you can't point to a person and say, that's your will. It's a universal agreement or a universal understanding. If we are good, then as a society, we can be trusted to have a good will. This goes back to Aristotle to some degree. Aristotle talking about friendship and wishing the other person well, that a virtuous good person cares for other people. They're not selfish. Whereas for Hobbes, he believes that we're also selfish and the world is filled with fear and anxiety, that we can't trust the other people. We can't have a good will. We need the sovereign. But Rousseau doesn't buy it. And he sees in his own life examples of that, of people having a good will in the face of overwhelmingly corruptive forces. Here's a story, and I wish I knew if it was a reliable story, but it goes something like this. And if this is wrong, put it in the comments and tell me this is a fallacious story. It's not true of Rousseau, but I think it's true. While he was wandering, at a number of points, of course, he was without food and he became hungry, without money. And he came upon a home, and he went to the kitchen of the servants' quarters and he asked for bread and water. And the servant came out and gave Rousseau bread and water. And when the servant saw that Rousseau was not a spy by the headmaster, the person who owns the home, who would be testing the servant to see if the servant is giving away food, which would be bad, then the servant brought out, I don't know if it was turkey or ham, I think it was ham actually, brought out something nice for Rousseau to eat. So notice the layers here, if the story's true. Rousseau, in a moment of need, goes to somebody who has nothing. This is a servant. They don't have anything. They live at the whim of the headmaster, the owner of the home. And they're afraid that if they do good, they will be punished. Now, the headmaster, the owner of the home, should want to do good, but that's clearly not the scenario here. So this person gives Rousseau the minimum to make sure, all right, you're not a thief. You genuinely need more. Then they risk their job and ostensibly, maybe even their own life, because where else are they going to go? Maybe they don't have any other options. I don't know how bad it was. But certainly they were risking punishment, severe punishment, by caring. Risking punishment by being compassionate. So Rousseau is seeing this, he's experiencing this, and he says, aha, those who have the least really do seem to care the most. It's so strange. But this is the beginning of this idea of an authentic social existence. In that servant who gave it to Rousseau, in the servant is an example of the general will that will exist for Rousseau in all of us if we simply return to our natural selves. We will want to care for others. We will have little, perhaps, of our own, but when we see people in need, we will act. That's all he's saying. So the general will is a strange, kind of opaque idea. There are problems with it because, obviously not everyone's going to agree. This is an obvious problem. People are not going to agree. But Rousseau's response is, when you have an agreement among a body of people, How you would get that agreement is not clear. I mean, would you go to union meetings? How would you send emails around and everybody would check a box? But he's saying if we tap into the natural self, that natural will, the general will, should emerge on its own because it's good. But people who don't agree, what do you do? Well, his response is that they're basically being selfish. You have to force them to follow. They can leave society, or they have to conform. It's not a perfect situation. He's not so naive as to think that everyone is going to agree with everything. But again, it's his motivation to find the good in humans, to find that natural, authentic self, and to express that through the general will. Criticism is that he seems naive, really naive. He's discussed these really overwhelming forces and the perversion of the mentality and the ethics of the rich and the elite, the hatred for everyone except their own elite class. So how can the general will fight against that? That's a very interesting question. And I think it's a very important question because that's the one we're faced with right now. Overwhelming inequality fueled by a sense of indifference, a lack of empathy for those that need food, vaccines. So we're watching this unfold even almost 2 years into the pandemic. Wealthy nations with vaccines that are expiring because they're not distributing them fast enough, and they don't want to send them overseas to nations that need them, and so they just sit on the shelves expiring. I understand, right? You protect yourself first, you take care of yourself first, and then you try to help others. But to protect yourself first and not helping others at all seems to be a missing step there for some countries. And of course, it's never a perfect system. But that mindset, the general will, wouldn't we all want to take care of anyone? And if we had excess, if we had leftover food, shouldn't we want to give it? But going further, what if instead of getting 2 doses of a vaccine, we only took 1 and gave another dose to another country? Now that would be sacrifice. And that's a different conversation, a whole different level of ethics. Not just giving, I have excess, you can have some, but I don't have excess, I have very little. And like the servant person, here's my food anyway, even though I may be punished. Social laws are screwing us up for Rousseau. Again, greed, economics, all of these things. The moment we started to carve up land, and farmers going out and carving up land, we created a level of envy or jealousy or greed, a possession, my world, that it seems inevitable that had to happen, but we haven't adapted to that. We haven't changed as a society. We haven't learned to distribute those things fairly or equally, which leads to greater and greater inequality. So the general will comes in, and there's a sense of unification, of unity, of this great, not specifically one person's will, but the natural consensus of authenticity, the natural flow of what is good in all of us. Because one person's will is always going to mess up, one person's will is going to lead us astray. But doesn't this seem kind of inauthentic in a way? That as individuals, we give ourselves over to this big ocean tide, this general will that will roll over all of us. Doesn't that seem kind of inauthentic where I'm just following the herd? No, again, he says, because remember, we are responding to the goodness in all of us. The general will is the good that exists naturally within us. And when we realize that, we're realizing what we really are. By contrast, the radical individuality that leads to, again, these different hierarchy of equality and power, and I'm better than you are, and such and so on. That's inauthentic for Rousseau. So following the general will is about respecting one's individuality, what we are inside, the good, as much as also following the herd. Does that totally make sense? Well, I'm not completely sure how that works, but that's the basic idea. Another way of thinking about this, we could go back to Plato and Socrates that believed in a ethical rationalism. There is good in nature. There's something good, innately good, that we don't create, that we respond to, that we can act on, but it's not our creation. There's something good. And the general will is a response to what is good and to what is just. Justice exists. Equality exists. We need to tap into that. I find this mechanism or these terminologies helpful. For Rousseau, there are a couple of ways of thinking about yourself. There are two major elements in all of us. The love of self, which is a good thing, love of self, but then self-love, which he's going to say is a bad thing. Self-love is a bad thing. So let's start with the bad thing. The bad thing is you seeing yourself, self-love, through the eyes of other people. How do people see you? Do they see your skin color, so therefore that's how you see yourself? Do they see your wealth, maybe a fancy car, some nice clothes or something like that, and that's how they see you? Your gender, is that how they see you, and therefore that's how you see yourself? It's one thing, society sees me this way. It's another to see myself the way they see me. Do you see how they see you? Or do you see how I'm trying to see how this makes sense? Okay, can I say see anymore? I'll try. So that self-love is, I love me when I'm peer pressure, when I'm doing exactly what they want me to do. I look a certain way, and I'm not being bullied because I fit in. I fit in. Fitting in for Rousseau into a culture that's corrupt and unfair and full of inequality and injustice. Self-love is just another way of being programmed. But there's this other sense of love of self. The love of self is the more authentic, obviously, in which one confronts the popular consensus about how you ought to be. The love of self is self-preservation because you're fighting against being programmed by these bad outside hostile forces, and it's self-respect. You respect the natural self. Imagine the pressures around that servant who gave the food to Rousseau. If the servant only had self-love, if the servant only processed, I see me as my master sees me, then that servant could never have given any kind of help to Rousseau at all. It would have been just pure hostility. Rousseau came to the door, and the servant, full of self-love, seeing himself as the world sees him, get out of here, Rousseau. Scram. Instead, there's this other self-respecting, more natural, kind self inside that is in conflict with the larger culture outside. So we reject self-love, and we respect or find a new respect for ourselves. For me, one of the great hallmarks of Rousseau is this emphasis on this idea of our capacity for compassion, to feel with other people what they're feeling and to act. Pity is sweet. Rousseau is famous for saying that phrase, pity is sweet. Again, the example of the servant, but there are many others. When someone doesn't need to give, when someone isn't obligated to take care of another, but they do, that's a sign of a natural goodness, an authentic self. And if we as a society can embellish on that or expand on that in terms of the general will, everyone will be happier. Everyone will be better off. But what is compassion? I will argue that compassion is basically, and I think this is what Rousseau was saying, a shared appreciation for our weaknesses and our miseries that we suffer. And that compassion binds us together. It joins us. It was just strange for Rousseau, right? This solitary figure who really pushes for the individuality. But an authentic society is one that realizes that on our own, and as a society, of course, we suffer, we feel pain. And being blind to that and just ignoring that leads to all kinds of injustices. But having a sense of pity and compassion breaks through our routines, it breaks through our disconnectedness, and it connects us. You can't have a general will where everybody agrees on how to have a course of action, how to run a society, without pity. You can't. I suspect that today, if Rousseau was alive, he would see our culture as obsessed with efficiencies and calculated reasoning. Calculated profit margins, calculated forms of happiness based on money and finances, in which large-scale suffering from the abuses of wealthy nations taking advantage of poorer nations, and from everything from the sweatshops to the global warming and pollutants in the atmosphere, he would see this as a complete misunderstanding, a disconnectedness from being a shared compassion or pity. We would never, so this was in the 90s, Nike, the shoe company, got caught with having sweat labor, children making shoes in dangerous conditions in countries that could afford to pay very, very little, like pennies a day, and then they could sell shoes in the U.S. at a very high cost. Now, whoever knew about that, and it's not clear who exactly knew that was going on, that's a perfect example of the prototype of what Rousseau was talking about. Someone who doesn't care about other people, has totally lost connection with what it means to be human, is not a natural self, is being controlled by social forces that push for profit and money above all else. In response to that, the general will push for our natural goodness as compassion. Here's a quote from his famous book, Emile, in which he talks about a hypothetical child being educated. So he became famous for his philosophy of education. See what you think. But here's a quote that reinforces everything we've talked about and will help lead us forward. Everything is good as it leaves the hands of the author of things, God. So everything is good that leaves the hands of the author of things. Everything degenerates in the hands of man. He turns everything upside down. He wants nothing as nature made it, not even man. For him, man must be trained like a school horse. Man must be fashionable in keeping with his fancy like a tree in his garden. End quote. This refers also to, relates closely to another quote. Man is born free, but is everywhere in chains. Man is born free, but is everywhere in chains. Rousseau. What's he saying? We're born good, we're born free, but then we mess everything up. And we mess it up. We don't have to mess things up, but we mess it up maybe because of expediency. It's just a misunderstanding. So cultures are perverse. To help fix this perverse world that we live in, we need to rethink education, and we need to rethink just how children are raised, how we are born into a world that's messy, but then learn to do something about it. Okay. His argument is that we should have basically a hands-off approach. This has become what is called a negative education. It's not negative in the sense of being pessimistic. It's negative in the sense that you take things away. Consider that you may have had these experiences in your life. What is education? Read this textbook. Do what your teacher tells you. Do these tests. Do these very specific, very formulaic, very specific things because we as a society want you to be good at business. We want you to be good at science. We want you to be employable. We want you to be employable. So you're going to do these things. Fine. Standardized testing, standardized education. Rousseau looks at that, or would look at that, society today, as terrible. Right? It's terrible because it's a very, very specific form of education, to the point you could even call it propaganda, because it's not really that open-ended. It's very forceful in this is what we've determined a good person to be, and a good person is employable. Does that create a sense of self-worth? Does that create a sense of morality? Does that create a sense of compassion or pity? Does that leave the child in a position where they can become creative and engaging with their interests, their passions? Education ought to do this, to save society, but to save the individual. Education ought to allow children to live naturally, spontaneously, and therefore authentically. Naturally, spontaneously, authentically. So get rid of the formula, okay? Let them be natural. That is, get rid of the dominant consensus. This is the kind of person you should be. The self-love. This is how you should interpret how you see yourself based on how we see you. Get rid of that. And then this yields this more authentic existence in which there's a tutorial role here. There can be a tutor helping guide children. Don't lick the electric fence or something silly like that. You see kids, especially in Canada, licking frozen pole. Right? So you need a tutor of some kind to help guide them away from dangers. But otherwise, hands off. Let them experience the world as they experience the world. And what does this remind you of? Rousseau's upbringing, his own life. He didn't have, even textbooks for Rousseau are a bad thing in formal education. Not books, because he loves books, but the idea of a textbook saying, this is the truth, this is how you ought to see the world. So he has this one extreme. No education, let children learn on their own like he learned, as if that's going to work. Now, I would argue that that's not sustainable, that many children wouldn't learn, just if only because in most families today, both parents have to work. This happened with my wife and I when everybody had to go online for online learning because of COVID. Our youngest, who was 4 at the time, we simply did not have time during the day to help him. We couldn't help him do basic rudimentary English or language. We were working 9, 10, 11 hours each. So without school to send our children to, we really, I mean, we realized he was, it's kindergarten. It's not make or break, so we didn't put a huge amount of effort into it. But just the way the system is currently set up, is negative even education even feasible or practical? It may be interesting, and it may be good in many ways, but just in the current system, it doesn't seem to be entirely plausible. So what have we learned? We have learned that according to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, we're messed up, and we're messed up because of efficiency, selfishness, and greed. The world is upside down in terms of who should be in charge. We should not have governments as organized bodies, people at the top. They make the decisions in the Senate, and then they tell us what to do. We as a population can have, he believes, in very practical, concrete terms, a general will that realizes a better form of humanity, an authentic form of humanity, and brings that out, manifests in culture as a healthier, better way to live. It's more natural, it's less prone to the greed and envy that we've discussed, the cruelty. Education is going to play a very important role in this. We need to rethink how people are being taught to be people. We need to open things up. We need to really push less of this self-love, to push less this idea that I find value in me because you tell me I have value. We need to get beyond that. Rousseau's strange, weird upbringing and experiences, do they translate? Maybe a little bit, but the uniqueness of his life, which leads to the uniqueness of his philosophy, in many ways might just not be that practical. A good ideal in many ways, but not practical. So our job is to find a way to take the best in Rousseau, abandon the part where he abandoned his own children, and try to make a better world with it.